welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another guest to introduce to you now. Cynthia Thurlow is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out her first appearance on our podcast on episode 116 of Boundless Body Radio. Cynthia is a nurse practitioner, the CEO and founder of the Everyday Wellness Project, and international speaker, which includes 2 TEDx talks, with her most recent talk, titled Intermittent Fasting Transformational Technique, that now has over 10 million views on YouTube. Wow. With over 20 years of experience in health and wellness, Cynthia is a globally recognized expert in intermittent fasting and nutritional health. She has been featured on several media outlets and television programs. She is also the host of the podcast Everyday Wellness, which frequently ranks as the top health and nutrition podcast on Apple. Her new book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, is a 45-day program to help women lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging. You can find Cynthia at www.cynthiathurlow.com. Cynthia, welcome back to Boundless Body Radio.
Oh, thank you for that warm introduction. I'm really been looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I have too. I'm a little bit frazzled. Just before the call, for some reason, my auxiliary cable wasn't really working. So we had to find a new way to connect you through the phone, which is on a Bluetooth connection. So yeah, sound might be just a little bit different, but you're coming in loud and clear. And it's just such an honor and privilege to talk to you. And since we last talked, you did a thing. You wrote a book.
Yes, I did. I feel like I birthed a child amidst the how do I say this? The energetically interesting last 2 years, for sure.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Is it as hard as you thought it would be, or much harder, much easier?
You know, I think the honest answer was the book proposal writing process, I think, was actually more challenging than writing the book. And that is largely due to the fact it's the first time I've actually been through that process, and it gets very, very granular. Obviously, the whole kind of theme of the book is a program that I created almost 3 years ago. So from that perspective, it was easier because I've actually been teaching this content, multiple times a year for several years. So that aspect of it was certainly easy, but it's really humbling when you put your vision and your ideas on paper, and then individuals have an opportunity to read it and review it and offer input and perspectives. And so my goal with Intermittent Fasting Transformation, IF45, is to really help women change the trajectory of their lives, irrespective of what, stage of life they're in.
I love that. And I just have to say, I have so much respect for people that know their topic so well that they can go in great depth into the details of something, but they can also explain it in a way that, maybe like a 5-year-old could understand. And you certainly have that gift. It's almost like Ben Bickman. Ben Bickman kind of do the same thing.
Yeah.
You can go way into the sticks on something, but also make it really easy and simple to understand. And it's really motivating. And you certainly are really great at that. And it really shone through in the book.
Oh, well, thank you. I have to tell you that's an incredible compliment, because Ben is obviously someone I respect enormously. And I have to agree with you that he does just a masterful way of making science accessible for everyone. And he's probably the person's book I recommend the most when people really want to understand insulin and understand the basis of chronic disease, here in the United States and other westernized countries. So I have to tell you, I really take that compliment to heart. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. You're up there right with him. Really love both of you and the messages you share. Before we get into the content of the book, I want the audience to, just in case they haven't heard of you before, which means they've been living under a rock for quite a while, can we hear your story and how you got into this world?
Yeah, so I'm a traditionally trained Western medicine nurse practitioner. And so my background was in ER medicine and cardiology. And up until 2016, I worked for a very large private practice in Northern Virginia and still love cardiology, love everything about the heart. But I was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the fact that our current focus on chronic disease management is really missing the mark, that I feel in many, many ways we need to start really educating people about lifestyle medicine in order to prevent chronic disease states even occurring. And so I got to a point where I was just increasingly very weary of writing one prescription after another. And in cardiology, you can imagine there's quite a few. And at some point I had considered doing a PhD program, took a class, didn't like that. I did a wellness coaching program, which I enjoyed, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. And then I read a book called Eat the Yolks and reached out to the author and said, where did you get your training? This is completely different than anything I learned in undergrad or grad school. And so I actually did a functional nutrition program, and that completely lit me up, enough so that my cardiology colleagues would jokingly tease me about how I was so cute about worrying about food as medicine. And so then I just literally got to a point one day where I couldn't write another prescription. And of course, I'm married to a very fiscally responsible, conservative engineer husband who was astounded that one day in 2016, I woke up and I said, I can't do this anymore. And so I took this massive leap without a business plan, left clinical cardiology and jumped into the entrepreneurial space, and almost instantaneously really attracted a particular niche of women that were largely my own age, who felt underserved and underappreciated by the current medical system. And I very quickly started creating programs in response to their needs. And, my journey to doing a couple TED Talks was really motivated as a introvert. I did a lot of public education when I was working as an NP. I would go into nursing homes and would represent the practice I work for, doing a lot of outreach. I enjoy patient education, enjoy, speaking to people. It's actually something I love doing. And so I thought, okay, I want to challenge myself. I'm going to do a TED Talk because I'll have to commit something to memory and then present it. And that just seemed like a really big, scary goal. And so in 2018, I started writing applications. I accepted an offer to speak in Toronto. It was my first TEDx. And right around that time, I was offered a second one. And so obviously, if anyone's familiar with TED Talks, you can't talk about the same subject twice. That's be something completely different, completely original. And so I looked at my husband and I said, what do I know a lot about? And he was like, oh, intermittent fasting. And so fast forward to 2019, I'd already committed to this talk in South Carolina. And preceding that by about a month and a half, I got very sick, spent 13 days in the hospital, almost died. And the two things I thought about when I was lying in the hospital bed was, number one, I want to get home to my family. Number two was I'm still giving this talk. And to the credit of the TEDx organization, they kept offering me every out they could think of. They didn't want me to feel obligated to come after having been so sick. And I kept saying, this is really part of my recovery. I wanted to prove to my children that my brain still worked, even though my body had not really been functioning properly. And so 27 days after leaving the hospital, I delivered that TED Talk. And I get pretty emotional when I think about it, because there was nothing beyond just proving to my children that I was okay. That was really the reason to want to do it, and to also share information that I knew would be helpful, really having no idea what was going to happen. My life changed forever in May of 2019 when that talk went viral. And I kind of sat back and thought, wow, the universe is a pretty amazing entity, because, I believe the universe gives and the universe takes. And so I feel like there was an energetic exchange of some substantial degree. And so obviously from that viral talk came programs that I teach, quarterly, IF45, which is the basis for this book, as well as opportunities to be able to impact many lives on a much more profound and deeper level than I ever could have if I were still seeing patients in the hospital and clinic. And so I sit in complete gratitude. And if no one has actually heard of the talk, or has not heard of the concept of intermittent fasting, I do truly believe it's a strategy that both men and women can benefit from, especially in our culture that unfortunately, based on a 2018 study, and we're looking at data from UNC Chapel Hill School of Public Health, that 88.2% of Americans in 2018, I'm sure it's much higher now, are not metabolically healthy. And you start to recognize they really, really need to change the tide and really start changing the discussions we're having with our patients and make it more about the lifestyle as medicine piece. Obviously, there is the need for urgent and emergent care, obviously surgeries. By no means am I being critical of my amazing colleagues that are on the front line right now. But I do think as it pertains to preventative management, we have to start changing the discussion. We have to start talking about food, eating less often, and all the other lifestyle as medicine components to really ensure that we can keep our population much more metabolically healthy.
Wow, I totally agree. And it's just, you're right. It's so inspiring to hear your story and to realize like you took on this challenge. Like if I take on a challenge, it's like, I want to do like 50 push-ups today. Like that's a pretty good challenge for you. You take on this challenge to get on stage at TEDx and put yourself completely out there. And you're right. I do believe that the universe rewards us when we show it that we're ready to share our message and share our talents and gifts on whatever sphere that we can. And so I really love that. I'm so glad you pulled through, and I'm so glad you're carrying that message out to the world. Before we deep dive into the book, it gets a little confusing when people hear the term intermittent fasting. Well, what is intermittent fasting? Is it extended fasting? Is it time restricted eating? Is it dry fasting? Is it wet fasting? Is it 5-2? Is it 16-8? Like there's so many different, types of fasting. We throw these terms around all the time. I just want to hear your definition of what intermittent fasting is.
It is as simple as eating less often. And you just alluded to different variations in fasting, whether it's the time spent in an unfed state. You alluded to different types of fasting, dry fasting versus drinking water or bone broth, etc. And I think it really focuses in on, what are your goals? But the most traditional form of fasting really is the 16-8. That's the one that I think people are most familiarized with. Obviously, there are lots of variations. A lot of it's dependent on what someone's goals are, whether it's gut health, whether it's immune function health, whether it's body composition changes. And, with goals are changes in the way that we will go about eating less often. But I typically start the conversation with the concept of eating less often because unfortunately, I truly believe that the concept of fasting or the word fasting is triggering, that it makes people feel that they're in a state of lack. And I'm someone that really likes to keep our thoughts reframed. So I just use it as eating less often, and that seems much more benign. And for many people, they can wrap their heads around that concept as opposed to, for those people who are triggered by the word fasting, the lack of food, I would say, let's eat less often. And I think that is a much more welcoming, if you want to think of it as dipping your toe into the pond of fasting, that concept tends to be much more amenable and agreeable for most people.
Yeah, it's so simple to understand. I really appreciate that. It's interesting how it becomes more easy over time. I remember, I was brought up in a religion where we had to fast one time a month for 24 hours, which basically meant you had one day that was absolutely miserable and 29 that were miserable because you were thinking about the next time you had to do it. And now going 24 hours is quite easy for me, and I do it most days anyway. Explain why that is. What's going on when it seems like fasting is very, very difficult in the beginning, but it becomes easier and easier to the point that it's almost preferred after a while?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's It's not just retraining your body; it's retraining your mindset around food. We've been conditioned to believe for such a long period of time that we have to eat frequently to quote unquote stoke our metabolism, that we need to snack in between meals, that we need to eat air quotes, heart healthy grains, that we need to be eating, 10 times a day. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And so what I oftentimes find is that when people start acquiescing to the methodology of fasting, that initially it is challenging. And that's because their body doesn't run efficiently. If 88.2% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy, they're not able to switch between using carbs versus fats for energy. So is it any wonder that these individuals have energy slumps in the middle of the day or after a meal, that they are frequently hangry? They get, when they get hungry, they get grumpy. And I have a child that was that way when he was little. He's obviously now, he's much more woke at this point. But you start to think about, stubborn weight loss. Why is someone struggling with that? Well, their body can't switch between using two different forms of fuel. And so on many, many levels, as people's bodies are metabolically flexing from using predominantly carbohydrates as a fuel source into using ketones and fatty acids as fuel sources, they start to feel cognitively more alert. They have more energy. They're able to lose weight. They get suppression in these hunger hormones. They have all these counter-regulatory hormones that will help suppress hunger, and not suppress it in a way that you don't eat, but that you're not fixated on it. And I think that one of the things that's really important for people to understand is that when your body is able to tap into fat stores for energy, you have sustained energy. It's preferred, breaking down fatty acids into ketones and utilizing things like beta hydroxybutyrate, which we know diffuses directly across the blood-brain barrier. I mean, our brain loves fat as a fuel source. So on many, many levels, I think as people are making this transition, and for some people it takes a shorter amount of time than others, if someone is significantly metabolically inflexible and unhealthy, they're not going to go from fasting, eating, 6 meals a day to fasting, and instantaneously it's going to be a painless process. It's much like riding a bike. You got to put the training wheels on first and slowly develop the skills to be able to balance and to be able to stop and start. It will take some people, 6 to 8 weeks to be able to get to that point, but they will get to a point where fasting will seem much more effortless. They will auto-regulate their hunger. They will be able to really lean into what true intrinsic hunger is. And one of the other, problems that I see with men and women, quite frankly, is that they haven't gotten hungry in such a long period of time because they've learned to get up and eat. Then they have a snack mid-morning, they're having a fatty coffee, then they're having lunch, they're having something mid-afternoon, then they have dinner, then they're snacking in the evening. So they're never really giving their body an opportunity to have digestive rest. And I will mention that there's a really amazing process that goes on in the gut called the migrating motor complex. And our bodies genuinely need 4 to 5 hours between meals because it allows our body to be able to effectively break down our food. It helps with detoxification, pushing microbes that don't belong in the gut. It helps protect our health. And on many, many levels, these things do not happen if we're eating with tremendous meal frequency. We're not able to stabilize our blood sugar. We're not able to tap into fat stores. And this is not the way our bodies are designed to thrive. That I oftentimes have to discuss the whole concept of feast and famine, that the reason why we're here as a species is because there was food scarcity. There were no grocery stores. There were no mini marts. There was no Amazon. I can order, a bunch of junk and have it delivered to my home. People had to go out and hunt their food, and maybe they had a feast, and maybe they didn't have food for a couple of days. And so people really had to be able to be metabolically flexible to actually utilize fat as a fuel source so they could sustain their lives.
So you're saying like peasants in the field didn't have yogurt snacks and granola bars at 10 in the morning, take a little break.
Correct. Or protein bars,
Yeah.
any of these things that, are modern day conveniences that are largely unhealthy.
Well, I love that. I love that explanation of all the things that can go awry with our current system. I'm curious why you chose to focus on your book specifically on women and talking about like balancing their hormones.
Well, it's a good question. Well, what it came down to was in December of 2018 when I accepted that second TED Talk, they asked me to focus on fasting in women. So it was never intended initially for it to be slanted towards women, but because that talk on women and fasting was the one that went viral, that became apparent that was a theme I was going to have to utilize in this first book. So that was as simple as that. It was just carrying on with what I perceived to be an area that hadn't really been focused on in terms of content for book writing, and certainly not by a clinician. I know that there are individuals out there that have written books. You can find a couple of them on Amazon or other places, but certainly not by a clinician. And so I decided to kind of use that as the impetus for this being the focus. And so I think in many ways, women are not many men, and we tend to be a little bit more complicated physiology-wise, given the fact that our body's predominant focus during our fertile years is procreation. Even if you decide not to have children, that really is the way that our body is designed, is that we are designed to carry and support life. And so because of that, fasting and just our physiology requires us to fast differently than men. And I do dive into this in specifics, intermittent fasting transformation, because as I remind people, I'm not someone who fearmongers, and I don't like when I see, I'm sure well-meaning people fearmongering on social media about fasting. But as it pertains to women, there are ways to do it properly at any stage of your life, whether it's in your peak fertile years, whether it's during perimenopause or menopause. There are definitely areas that we have to focus on. And adjust. I oftentimes will say that menopausal women and men, because their hormones tend to be a little bit more stable, probably have less issues fasting than women at, their peak fertile years, or women in perimenopause where they're kind of in reverse puberty, which is, kind of a layman's explanation for what's happening in our bodies. But on many, many levels, I believe, especially given how metabolically unhealthy the population is overall, that this is a strategy that both men and women can utilize. But specific to this book and my talk, I was asked to kind of lean in to serve a population that I felt in many ways you can't fast exactly like a guy. We can't. And so I think it really does us a disservice if we don't have someone that is coming out and speaking on this topic in particular and doing it from a place of empowerment.
Well, I really love that approach. Really interesting. I wanted to ask you about the different stages in life and how fasting changes. And so do you recommend that women do more carb cycling early in their life and then after menopause do it maybe a little bit less? How do you approach that?
Yeah, great question. So I love the concept of carb cycling, especially if someone is lower carb or doing a ketogenic diet. We know that women, as they get closer to menopause, become increasingly more insulin resistant. Now, add in the metabolic inflexibility, and that can be worse. But I oftentimes will suggest, when women are in their 20s and 30s, they get a lot more flexibility than they do in their 40s, 50s, and beyond. And so it's not to suggest carbohydrates are bad, but I do like women to get the bulk of their carbohydrates from non-starchy vegetables. And when they're upcycling their carbs, they're being smart about it. Like, don't sit down with a big plate of pasta. I would much rather you get some sweet potato or squash or some low glycemic berries. That's predominant. Or if someone tolerates grains, although I find a lot of women don't tolerate grains, or if someone tolerates beans. But again, trying to mitigate and manage the blood sugar response as it pertains to increasing carbohydrates can be very bio-individual. I'll give you an example. I am obviously a 50-year-old woman, and I have to be conscientious about my carbohydrate intake, but I have been carb cycling for years successfully. And I would never describe my diet as ketogenic. It's lower carb, and that works well for me. But on a higher carb day, I will get my carbohydrates predominantly from squash, sweet potato, root vegetables. That's what my body likes best. I love plantains. Plantains do not like me. I mean, I laugh. I was just on vacation with my family, and I wear a continuous glucose monitor. And so I was on vacation, so I'm going to have some plantains. And these aren't even sweet plantains. These are, regular kind of bland plantains that they can make into a chip, or they can cook that end up being more like savory, like salty. Every time I eat them, my blood sugar will spike up to 150. Not a bad food, but that food for me is not a good food. And so with awareness, women can select specific types of carbohydrates that work better for their bodies. I have clients who do well with rice. I don't do well with rice. I have other clients that like quinoa. But when we're talking about carb cycling, it might be a quarter cup, a third a cup, a half a cup. It's not copious amounts of carbohydrates. And I think that's the common misnomer that most Americans, when they sit down and plate food, they think about the carbs first and the protein at the end. And I remind almost everyone, most, if not all Americans, men and women, don't eat sufficient amounts of protein. So protein should always be plated and prioritized first for many, many reasons. One, for satiety. Two, for just the fact that we lose muscle mass with age. So really trying to maintain lean muscle mass. Muscle is the organ of longevity, as Dr. Gabrielle Lyon likes to state. And so we want to think about muscles as being glucose reservoirs. So one way to improve our insulin sensitivity and make sure we're really working on satiety is to hit those protein macros. So to kind of get back to your original question, carb cycling can absolutely be part of the equation for women, but it really is dependent on where you are lifestyle wise, whether you're still getting your cycle. And I do like women to increase their carbohydrates at the tail end of their luteal phase, right before they are menstruating. And then for women who are postmenopausal, when they haven't had a menstrual cycle in over 12 months, they really may have 1 or 2 days a week that they're doing more carbohydrates, but it's going to be those smart carbs, not the pasta, bread, cookies and cream, and those kinds of things that I know in maybe in your 20s you can get away with, but those dietary indiscretions don't serve us well at a different stage in life.
Mm. Well, and you wrote an entire chapter about the things we should focus on when it is time to eat. And so I love the way you explain that, focus on the protein, carb cycling, if that is what fits. I love using a CGM to find out, how different foods affect you, because that's not the same for everybody. Where does fat fit in? Like, how much fat would you generally recommend for people, or how do they know they're getting enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's this common misnomer. I see a lot of people doing keto wrong, meaning keto doesn't mean it's all the fat. Like you don't sit down with a plate of bacon and avocados and nuts. I mean, fat is a more nutrient dense macronutrient as opposed to protein and carbs. That's the first thing, smaller portions. Oftentimes fats are included in the meats that you're eating. So if you've got a ribeye or you're eating salmon, you already have the fat in the meat or the fish. So really being mindful about, what your needs are. I personally don't do well with heavy fat meats. Like I don't do well with ribeye, but I do fine with filet. I actually do fine with salmon, but I don't do well with, fattier cuts of poultry. Like if someone gave me duck, that isn't my thing. But I do fine with, leaner cuts of meat and fish. That's just me personally. But I have plenty of, colleagues, friends, patients that can do duck fat and tallow and lard. And so I just remind people, plate the protein first. Ask yourself if there's already healthy fats in the meat. If there are, you don't need copious amounts of fats. Don't add in 2 avocados and wonder why you can't lose weight. And the other slippery slope about fat is that one area where I see a lot of people struggle is their portions of nuts, seeds, or cheese. Like for some reason, it's very hard to auto-regulate those items in particular. It's very easy to overeat nuts, very easy to overeat cheese. And so if you're trying to lose weight or you're struggling a little bit, maybe you have to measure out those portions. I'm a big fan of people not feeling like they have to measure all of their food, but maybe it's the visual cue of understanding, like, what does a quarter cup of nuts really look like? Or what does 1 ounce of cheese really look like? It's very likely smaller than the portions that you're eating. So instead of saying like you should have a 40, 50, 50, whatever, when you're looking at your meals, oftentimes I'm really suggesting for women to push the protein lever really strong, because that will kick in satiety. And one thing I think is really important to designate is if you sit down and just eat a plate of pasta, you'll just keep eating. Whereas if you sit down and have an 8-ounce steak, you're going to get full, and your satiety cues are going to be regulated. Like you have receptors in your stomach that will tell your brain like you are full. Whereas if you keep eating the pasta, you don't have that same kind of impetus. So I think in many ways, it's a bit of experimentation, obviously bioindividuality rules, meaning it really is based on the individual. Like if I sat down with 5 girlfriends and we're all at the same age and stage of life, our plates might look a little bit different, but it is generally comprised of lean protein, non-starchy vegetables, and then depending what that lever is, is it a higher carb day? Then maybe you have some sweet potato. Is it a lower carb day? Then maybe you have a little bit of avocado. Maybe you've used a little bit of olive oil. Maybe you've decided that you wanted some butter on your vegetables. There's all different ways to play it, but I think in many ways we've done such a tremendous disservice to our patients because we haven't empowered them to be able to make decisions for themselves without having to follow a plan. Like that is the thing I found most frustrating, is that people really want to just be told how to do everything. And I encourage them to be flexible, to do a little bit of trial and error, to find out what feels good for their body, and really understanding like, what does true intrinsic hunger feel like? What does satiety feel like? Like right before this podcast, I had a good sized lunch, and, I made sure I had a large portion of protein because I was like, this is probably the last time I'm going to eat today, because it's late. It's, almost 4:00 in the afternoon where I am in the country, and I probably won't get hungry again, and that's okay. But satiety, like the protein lever, is super important for people to acknowledge its existence, to recognize what it feels like to really feel full, because you won't be looking for more food when you're done. And that's an important distinction.
I love how you are able to explain that without getting too dogmatic into any one thing, and helping people understand like what's best for them might not be what's best for you. And also that might change in the course of your lifetime. My fasting patterns are a lot different than they were even like a year ago. They've changed because I didn't feel as good anymore doing what I was doing. So I think that's really well explained. So, okay. So we're preparing to take your program. We're starting to change the diet, is there any other things we need to be thinking about in preparation to do the 45-day program?
Well, I would say, obviously if you're eating 6 mini meals a day and snacking, you got to stop the snacking. I mean, that's almost the first step, because stopping snacking is going to force you to auto-regulate your meals. It's going to force you to up your protein, because you shouldn't be hungry between meals. Anyone that's listening, if you're hungry in between meals, it's because you didn't put your meals together properly. And that's not a criticism, it's just a fact. You should be able to, if you're going from 6 meals a day, which is really like 3 meals with 3 snacks, you should be able to go to, 1 snack amongst 3 meals. And then you go to no snacks. And then you really understand, like, how much egg do I need in the morning? How much chicken or steak or shrimp do I need with my lunch? Same thing with dinner, because once you hit that lever of finding the happy medium, and it could be 40, 50 grams of protein. And I would imagine most people who are listening are not eating enough protein. They're probably getting 50 or 60 grams, which is not nearly enough to be able to provide muscle protein synthesis to maintain their muscle mass. And that's really a concern. Like, that is a huge issue. Like, sarcopenia, which is this muscle loss with aging, will happen unless you do things to counteract that. And that includes lifting heavy things and eating enough protein. And that's a really important distinction, because I see a lot of women in particular, not as many men, women in the gym that are just kind of skinny. Like, they look skinny. They don't have as much muscle mass. And that's a byproduct of some of the physiologic changes that happen in our bodies as we transition from perimenopause to menopause. But we have to get that muscle protein synthesis. We have to be providing the fuel for our body. And we have to be stressing those muscles enough, along with a few other things, to make sure that we maintain our muscle. Because one of the reasons, if you look at MRIs of muscle, and you're looking at like a 25-year-old quadricep muscle versus a 70-year-old, you'll see it almost looks like marbling in the meat, in the muscle. I'm talking about a steak. But the point being, like, a lot of that marbling is because you're replacing muscle tissue with adipose tissue. And what is adipose tissue? It's generally an inflammatory organ. And so I remind people, maintaining that lean muscle mass is critically important. So back to your original question, you go from no snacking to reprioritizing your macros. And then I think, the other really important piece for people to understand is to understand what type of fasting are you doing and what can you consume in a fasted state. There's a lot of opinions about this all across social media. A lot of what I talk about in Intermittent Fasting Transformation, IF45, is talking about the value of a clean fast. I want people to learn good, sustainable habits so that they can then determine for themselves what is their purpose for fasting and what kind of results are they looking for. And by this, I mean, a clean fast encompasses filtered water with electrolytes. It encompasses black coffee, and it encompasses bitter tea. Bitter tea are things that are bitter, black tea, green tea, etc. And really navigating not adding copious amounts of cream and sugar and other things that actually blunt some of the bitter compounds that are found in coffee and tea. There are actual compounds in both of those, these polyphenols, that are these powerful plant-based compounds that can actually upregulate the benefits of fasting. And so I remind people, however you have to do it. Like, I don't love bitter things, although I will eat radicchio, I will eat endive, I will eat vegetables that are a little bit bitter on occasion, because it's good for our body to have these things. And so, as one example, when I started drinking green tea, because I'm not a coffee drinker, I would brew green tea, I would put a straw in it when it cooled down, and I would slurp it down. And my family found this fascinating. And I just said, there's too many benefits from drinking bitter teas to not do it. But the only way that I can do it, because I won't add sugar, I'm not going to add stevia, is to just do it this way. And so that has become a joke amongst my team, because they know this about me. But if you struggle with, the bitterness of plain coffee, add cinnamon. We know cinnamon upregulates insulin sensitivity. You can add salt. Like, I'm a huge fan of salting food. I love Redmond sea salt. I've had clients add sea salt to their bitter coffee, and they've been able to kind of acquiesce the flavor profile. So think about it this way: if you've been doing fatty, sugary frappuccinos for years, and then all of a sudden you try to drink a bitter cup of coffee, it's going to be a bit of an adjustment for your taste buds. So it may be that you have to employ a few of these strategies to make it palatable, but it's also the recognition. And I want to give credit to Dr. Mindy Peltz for this comment. So remember when you were in college and maybe you had, had tequila shots the first time. No one loved the taste of it. You just grow to accept it's part of what you have to do. It may be that you just have to grow to appreciate eating certain types of foods or eating them different ways and, allowing your palate to acclimate to that. Now, obviously, not a great comparison in the context of this conversation, but certainly it's important for people to understand what can you consume while fasted without breaking your fast. And this is a bone of contention. There are, I'm sure, well-meaning individuals across social media that will say, oh, if it's under 50 calories, it doesn't count. That's complete bunk. Anything that's going to generate an insulin response or what we call cephalic phase insulin response could potentially break your fast. And so I want people to learn how to do a clean fast so that they can get the best results, sustainable results.
Very well explained. I love that. Your plan is a 45-day guide. I'm curious why you chose that length of time.
Oh, it's a good question. So out of the viral TED Talk, my team and I quickly started putting together a program because I was like, the people are coming to me and they want something from me. And so initially it was a 60-day program, but I came to find out 60 days was too long. The 45 days seemed to be the sweet spot where people could commit to 45 days. And by 45 days, they felt like it was sustainable. 60 days was too long. So think about it, instead of 6 weeks, then you have 8 weeks, the program just felt long. The 45 days was definitely the sweet spot. And so from that came this program that I am, sharing and birthing to the world in March of 2022. So in many, many ways, it's just by trial and error, I just found that was a sustainable amount of time to start from as a starting place.
Yeah, I agree. I think of a 30-day program, and that feels like something I'm going to do for a month and then not ever do again. It feels like 45 could transition you onto something, that would produce habits that you could do for the rest of your life. You've also broken it down into 3 different phases, which I really appreciated. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about each phase and maybe some of the challenges and some of the benefits that happen in each one of those phases.
Yeah. So, when I think about, how we broke the program down, we wanted it to be, each stage is going to allow us to be able to garner the basic benefits and master those before we move on to the next stage. And so, we start with this introductory phase where you're learning the basics. This is someone who maybe they've never fasted before, but we're going to teach them how to get ready for this fasting period, to determine are you ready to fast? What's your sleep quality like? What's your stress management like? Are you still getting your period? Are you not still getting your period? Really getting granular and then kind of transitioning into this implementation phase where you are actually fasting. And depending on the individual, some people start with a 12-hour window and that's as slowly as they go. They start with 12 hours, they eat dinner at 6, they get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and maybe they're starving because normally they ate until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And so really that granular that they may need to start with a very short, tight fasting window. And then they slowly, maybe every week they open it up by 30 minutes. The goal is to get to 16. Does everyone get to 16 at the end of 45 days? Some people are really pushing the envelope, they're struggling to get there, but it's really all about bio-individuality. And then some people come to fasting and they are so ready to do 16 hours and they're able to do that within a week or two. And then, we come up, each phase has challenges, optional challenges, ways that we can push our bodies. I always say fasting is a way of looking at hormetic stress. The right amount of stress in the right amount at the right time can make us stronger as individuals, not just mentally, but physically. And then, the last phase is really kind of introducing advanced topics, advanced strategies, teaching people, deeper levels of, the science and the process behind fasting. And along with this are, nutrition, I had the best chef, absolutely the best chef we created recipes together that are very aligned with my mindset about being animal-based protein predominantly. And then, the lever about fats or not fats. I typically will tell people that if you're having a lower carb day, then you can increase your healthy fat intake. If you're having a higher carb day, you lower the amount of healthy fats in your meal. So really empowering people and breaking the macros down so that people can see, how satiating these higher protein meals are. And I find once we kind of retrain that methodology that people can have success. And then throughout this, we're talking about women at peak fertility years, women under the age of 35, what things look like for a woman who's perimenopausal, the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause, and then looking at through the lens of menopause, 12 months without a menstrual cycle. So making those distinctions is really, really important. Also kind of highlighting areas, troubleshooting is also a large focus of little aspects of each of those chapters, because I think it's helpful for people to have the feedback, like these are the things I see that can be problematic, or these are signs this is not working for you. Because I think in many, many ways, that's what's missing. When I'm on social media, I'm seeing content that other people are putting out. It's thinking really granularly about what are some of the signs this is working well? What are some of the signs this is not working well?
Well, there's the 3 phases, which I think is a good way to divide it up. But you also work in daily practices, which I absolutely love. Can you tell me a little bit about those daily practices? Some of them you wouldn't think would fit very well with fasting or wouldn't have anything to do with fasting. And I think they absolutely do. But can you tell me about why it was important for you to include something to do every single day?
Well, I think then it makes it attainable, because if the focus is just on fasting, that can get pretty boring pretty quickly. So it's encompassing lifestyle medicine, it's encompassing hydration, it's encompassing certain types of macros, it encompasses carb cycling, all those challenges. But I like people to have little wins so that every day they're doing something that's moving the needle closer to the kind of ideal life that they're looking for. And so in many, many ways, that program has really come out of trial and error, within my own groups that I've run, is what works and what doesn't work. Like I know with almost 100% certainty the questions that will come up at certain points during the program. And so that's why those little vignettes each day, there's a focus, because that's what we've come to find out has been most effective. The people don't want the program just to be about fasting. They want it to be a whole lot more. And so that's how we're able to kind of weave in that other content effectively.
Yeah, I love the one about gratitude. And I think there's so much power in things like journaling and like really writing this stuff down and being really intentional about it. I think it can improve so many different areas in our life. And I love that it keeps you on track. There's something new and unique every single day. You mentioned the chef. I want to talk about your recipes. Holy smokes, those look amazing. Those look really, really good. What were some of your favorite recipes and why did you decide to include those in the book?
Well, I think that there's so much, the honest answer is there's so much confusion about nutrition. And I fought really hard, really, really hard, because I think that there's, and this is no judgment, but there's a lot of plant-based narrative that's out there right now. And I think that's particularly potentially harmful for women that are insulin resistant, that have a lot of weight to lose, to try to be plant-based. It's really hard to get your protein macros where they need to be, because you have to eat a lot of carbohydrate, and carbohydrate that is starchy carbohydrate or is very calorically dense. And so I fought very, very hard to make sure that the proteins that were selected were accessible. So nothing that was considered to be really wilditarian, if you will. I love that concept, Terry Cochran's concept. So that proteins would be accessible. So obviously I'm a steak girl. I love steak. I love bison. I love salmon. So anything for me that is very protein packed. I like very flavorful sauces. So we made a big effort, chimichurris, flavorful sauces, but not things that are going to require a lot of unusual spices or seasonings. That's one thing I absolutely abhor, that every once in a while I'll find an amazing recipe online, and then I realize I have to buy 5 things I may never use again. And so I don't want things to be cost prohibitive. So, from my perspective, anything with chimichurri, any chilies, we've got lamb burgers, there's all sorts of, options that are in there. And the really cool thing is that people that do the pre-sale will actually get access to like 5 to 6 desserts that the same chef, Beth Lipton, who's amazing, created to go along as a bonus. So there were people who were asking, like, are there desserts in your book? And I always say, there's certainly like what I would call a sweet treat, but not something that I would think is particularly sinful or that will derail all of your hard work or effort. So for me, what I really liked was there was a lot of clean protein, a lot of variety, a lot of very flavorful, easy to cook recipes, things that weren't super complicated. Because I know, most people, whether it's men or women, all of us, given the way that the last 2 years have been, not all of us have as much free time as we did before. So I wanted to be mindful of that. But I did fight very, very hard for this book to be predominantly animal-based protein, but there are some vegetarian or what I refer to as, protein optional meals. If people are, they want to have a meatless meal, they can absolutely still, make the meal successfully, even without the animal-based protein that's in it.
Wow. Well, I so much appreciate that you made it easy. We used to run weight loss programs at the gym we used to work at, and we had a body fat scale, so we could tell whether people were losing just total weight or total fat. And we had tremendous results. Over 100 people lost. It was like 98% of the weight they lost ended up being from fat, not from water or anything else. And the only thing we really did with them is throw them a few Diet Doctor meal plans because they're so easy. Even people who don't necessarily do keto or low carb, you can add carbohydrates to those recipes. They have a few ingredients. They're not that difficult to cook. They're generally very, very delicious. And people get awesome results with that. When you get up there and give people these like food lists, and like, I remember one of my clients said she was crying at the grocery store one night because she doesn't normally shop and she was looking for arrowroot powder. I'm like, come on, like we got to make this, easy for people. And you certainly have achieved that. Like working with a chef, I know that I don't need to be a chef to be able to cook some of these meals. They look great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You also have a section that I really loved and I think is really, really important about how to cook eggs. So many people, probably including myself, get this wrong. And I love that you had that section of cooking eggs, like how to steam eggs. I use my Instant Pot to do that now. And I come up with really great soft-boiled eggs all the time. So I really appreciate that it's not just the recipes, there's techniques and tips and tricks and things that make it really easy because there's so many people in this generation that just simply don't have basic cooking skills to pull any of this off.
No, and I think that's important that I didn't want things to be intimidating. And I do have to give props and credit to Beth because she really listened to what I wanted and desired this book to be. She's so incredibly talented and I'm a big egg person. And so we tried to, pay homage to the fact that I love eggs and especially hard-boiled eggs. I'm like obsessed. I go through periods of time, I'm sure you do as well, you and your wife, where I get fixated on certain types of protein. And so I'm in an egg stage. And so we definitely honored a hard-boiled egg variation because that's definitely something that's so easy to like prep ahead of time and grab and go. You don't have to heat it up. It can, you can make it super portable, throw it on a salad, etc. But I agree with you that their cooking really has become a lost art in many ways. And so even though I have teenage boys, they both know how to cook because I remind them eventually you're not going to live at home and your parents are not going to be cooking for you. And I want you to have those skills so that you can feed yourself nourishing, healthy food and not just a bunch of junk.
Not just ramen and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that got me through college.
I would be so depressed. I would say, I'm like, they're, they laugh at me now. They think that because I'm gluten, green, and dairy free, they think that I just live in a bizarre world. But, I remind them, I'm like, well, you're entitled to your opinion. And when you go off to college and you live as a young adult, if you decide to eat differently, at least I've given you a good foundation of how to eat healthfully.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do appreciate the few things my mom taught me to do in the kitchen. They helped me with cooking immensely, but it was still way too much fast food and way too many cups of ramen noodles. Probably didn't help my grades too much. What's
funny is I think all of us probably ate some ramen. I mean, the school food was awful back in the day. And I remember I sustained myself on like tuna and salads and yogurt because the food was so bad. I mean, now I think a lot of colleges make an effort to make better food for students, but it certainly wasn't good. Back in the 90s when I was in college, it was not good food by any stretch of the imagination.
Wow. Yeah, no, not at all. What could people expect to find in the best practices and resources section? I found that to be really helpful as well.
Yeah, I mean, so it's going to be the products I love and the products I endorse and embrace. It includes products that I myself have white labeled, meaning products I myself have used and recommend to my patients and clients on the regular, companies I like to work with and endorse. And then also, supporting other companies that are like-minded. And so that's really what that section was designed for. I'm grateful that the publisher was willing to let me include that because I really practice from a place of gratitude. And so in many ways, a lot of those companies helped me build my business. And so I wanted to take an opportunity to make sure that they were acknowledged and, at least resources for people if they're looking for salt or looking for electrolytes or looking for products, kind of finding what works well for me, whether it's a supplement, even one that I don't white label, a supplement that I recommend oftentimes to my own patients and clients that they have the same information.
Yeah, totally. I love, sharing around the brands that we love as well. We're so fortunate. We are, Redmond is right in our backyard here in Utah. Mm-hmm. And so they're such a great company. We've loved talking to them over the years. Their products are amazing. So glad you were able to shout out those companies that are doing so much great work. And I just have to shout you out for doing such great work on this book. This plan looks really amazing. We see a lot of different plans and a lot of different people putting out good plans that can really work. But this has a really great combination of the science, tons of studies, 20 pages of references, down to like recipes and practical tips and gratitude, like you mentioned, like one of the pages in your book. And so I think you did a great job putting this together in a way that's really understandable, easy to digest, and really effective. This book is launching soon. Is that right?
It is. March 15th is the day officially, but it is on pre-order right now on Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble, or any of your local bookstores. And there are quite a few amazing bonuses that are only available to those who purchase the book ahead of time. And so they will all be available. And obviously we're talking about them on social media now, but they will all be available off the website. But you have to you have to purchase the book ahead of time to get those bonuses.
Gotcha. Well, we will make sure to link that and promote that in the show notes. One of the things that I found through podcasting is I spend so much time researching my guests, and we're releasing an episode every other day basically. And so it's a lot of research, and I found that some of my favorite podcasts I don't get to listen to as often unless I'm researching them. And interviewing you again gave me the opportunity to kind of catch up on some of your latest podcast episodes. And not only is your podcast the top rated every time I look, I don't know if it's always top rated, but every time I've ever looked, it is the very, very top in both health and nutrition. But you are a great podcaster, really, really, really good podcaster. I have a whole nother podcast where we talk specifically just about podcasting, and we get a lot of podcasts where the host talks way too much, or maybe they don't talk enough, or maybe they haven't done any research on their guests. It's like your episode recently with Sam Apple. Like, you came to that interview so prepared and ready to go. Like, you're a really, really good podcaster. And I really mean that. And I wanted to know, how has podcasting enhanced your life in other ways that you found surprising?
Oh, well, thank you for that. That means a great deal. I want to just say that I honor and respect and am so very grateful. I have to tell you that podcasting was not something I initially jumped into with tremendous enthusiasm. I had a colleague. So when I first started Everyday Wellness, I co-hosted it with a colleague, a friend of mine who's a clinical psychologist. And 1 year into it, she really wasn't into it anymore. And so I had to make a decision. Was I going to continue the podcast, or was I going to stop it? And the irony is, this is pre-pandemic. So right before the pandemic, I decided I was going to go all in. And then I realized I really loved podcasting because I had complete control over the direction of the podcast, the questions that were answered. And I'm a gigantic nerd. I just like to learn about people. And so what has come out of that is I think podcasting is probably one of my favorite things in my business. And so I so appreciate you acknowledging the preparation that I put in. I read every book. I like to get into people's heads. I want to hear them interviewed on other podcasts. I want to know about their background. Sam Apple was particularly interesting because his book is written in the context of Nazi Germany. And so you're weaving in this very interesting not real character, is someone who existed in real life, in the context of recognition that the scientist's entire career, the information was suppressed for years and years and years. And now we fast forward into 2020, and you realize how brilliant, or 2021, how brilliant Warburg's work was. And so for me, that was definitely a challenging interview because I really wanted to keep the politics out of it. Although I have strong opinions about Nazi Germany, but I felt that that's the only way I can put it. I was like, how do I have a conversation with Sam and honor the beautiful work he's done in this book and not talk about the fact that Warburg existed as a Jew in Nazi Germany and somehow survived and wasn't sent to his death. And so I had to kind of suppress that aspect of it and just really dig into the story. But yeah, I feel like podcasting is a gift and it's the best form of networking. I was actually talking to another podcaster the other day and she said, oh, podcasting is just the best form of networking. And I said, I'm going to have to borrow that and give attribution. So Melanie Avalon said that to me recently. And I have to agree with her that, we have so many opportunities to connect with such amazing humans, and to really do it right means you have to put in the work and the effort. So I'm always usually a week ahead of myself. I'm done with my own. I did 2 podcasts in my podcast this week, and then I have 12 guest podcasts, and I have 2 to prepare for next week. But I actually really genuinely enjoy getting to know people and getting to better understand what their gift to the world is, and just connecting. Like I don't know how many times this has happened to you. I've only had 3 instances where I've had to completely trash a podcast when someone's just either been really difficult to interview or the conversation has just not ended up in the direction that I think would be valuable to share with individuals. But over, 3 years of podcasting, only have 3, bad eggs over that period of time.
Wow.
I think is pretty extraordinary.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. I had one and I still feel bad to this day about it, but there's a few things you just can't really edit out. And unfortunately we ended up not publishing that. So I totally understand. And another thing that I really appreciate is you make episodes that haven't been done before. You're not asking exactly the same questions in exactly the same way. That's a lesson I had to learn early on. I did an interview with Sean Baker. He was our episode maybe 20 or 25. And I got off the phone and I was like, well, I've heard all of this. And I realized I just asked all the same goddamn questions that he gets asked probably 8 times that day in other podcasts. And so I really appreciate that you put in the effort and the work, and it creates something unique and different than I would expect to hear on other shows. So again, I really appreciate that. And I know your audience appreciates that as well. We have so much appreciated your time today. If you had to leave the listener with one simple tip from this conversation, what do you think that one simple tip would be?
I think the one thing that I would probably encourage listeners to ask of their healthcare provider is to have a fasting insulin drawn. And the reason why I say this is that I cannot tell you how many women, because I work with women, have gone to their healthcare provider and they get their fasting insulin drawn, and it provides so much information about their metabolic health. Obviously, there's other lab markers that can do that as well. The fasting insulin is oftentimes the missing piece. And if your fasting insulin is 20 or 15 or 30, you got work to do. And it'll further fuel the need to find strategies to become more metabolically flexible. So I've been on a metabolic flexibility focus over the last couple months. If you look at my content, perhaps unknowingly, I didn't realize I was doing that, but a lot of the conversations are really, really focused on metabolic flexibility through different lenses. And so for that reason, I feel as if your listeners should be inspired and empowered, and whether or not they do intermittent fasting is certainly their choice. But if you are metabolically inflexible and you find that your fasting insulin is more than 8, you got work to do. And so I would say that's what I would leave them with, to really make sure that information is available to them, that their healthcare professional is willing to do that lab. It is not a weird lab. It's not a functional medicine lab. It is you need to know for your health lab, and should be as routine as getting a lipid panel or a CMP, which is a comprehensive metabolic panel. Everyone needs to know that number. It should be done at least twice a year without question.
Yeah, that's great. I love that piece of advice. I'm so glad that we know enough now. At this point, we're still learning all the time, but at this point here, we know kind of the ranges and what we should expect, and where people are drifting up into areas where they are problematic, where I would say even, 5-10 years ago, we really didn't have a lot of that information. So I think that's great. I think it's really important for us to be our own advocates of health when we need to be, because there are other interests out there that aren't necessarily always in our benefit. Cynthia, this has been an incredible conversation. Tell the listener one more time where they can go to find you and connect with you and your work.
I'd say the easiest place to find me, where you can also get a link to pre-order the book, is www.cynthiathurlow.com. I am active on Instagram, Twitter. I am on LinkedIn. I have a private Facebook group called Intermittent Fasting / my name. That's a free Facebook group where you can connect with me. My podcast is Everyday Wellness Podcast, which I am so proud. It's, as I said, it's one of my favorite things that I can do. And you can find the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of your local retailers, including Target. And it's Intermittent Fasting Transformation IF45.
Excellent. We will link to all of that in the show notes. Cynthia Thurlow, thank you again so very much for all your work, for coming on our show the first time and really working super hard and writing a book and coming back on again. From what I can tell, this book looks amazing. It's got so many great resources, and I think it's going to benefit a lot of people. And so thank you again for writing it, and thank you for coming on our show today to help us understand it better. We are very much looking forward to that coming out, so thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.